Hello and welcome to the Home Mastering Q&A. And I've just realized I don't have my headphones in, so I won't be able to hear you guys if I don't put them in. So just bear with me while I sort this out. I've dropped a link in the chat comments if any of you would like to join me live on the call. So feel free to avail yourselves of that if you would like. And if you could, oh, Stephen, I see you're there. Add you into the stream, and I'm going to turn that down, and I'm going to press that button. Hi, thanks for being here. Just bear with me. Okay, I need an adapter. And that's good because it means that I know that the world can see me, which is always the first question that I ask. So, can I hear you? Say hello. No, I can't hear you. You're not muted. I can hear hiss, which is a start. I'm just going to go over to the YouTube tab. And okay, that's working, so I'm going to close that. Yeah, it must be some kind of routing thing. I'm going to wait while you get that sorted out. Give me a shout when you. If not, you can always drop questions in the chat. Aha. Okay, that works.
Well, hey.
Okay. Excellent. Good. Yeah, basically, well, actually, I usually like to start with questions from people who are on the call. So I don't know if you have a question that you would like to ask. You can have 2 or 3 seconds to think about that while I just say the other housekeeping stuff to everybody else, which is, yes, by all means, use the link that's in the chat to the right hand of the YouTube window if you'd like to join me on the call like Stephen. If not, you can ask questions in the chat and I should be able to see them here. And feel free to join in, leave a question in the YouTube chat if you would like to, but you don't want to be on the call. And yes, Stephen, feel free to interrupt me with answers to questions at any point. Did you have anything particularly you wanted to ask?
At this moment, no, but okay. Thanks for asking.
Oh, that's cool. My pleasure. Okay, so in which case...
I might get myself a glass of whiskey, though.
That's actually brandy, but yes, please do. It's very much, what's the word? Not frowned upon. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question from Rob, which is about choosing your fixed mastering level. He says, when you first talked about setting the mastering level, I thought you meant with a VU calibrated to -10 or -11, which I kind of do, but we'll come back to that. You then brought the gain to a point where it was bouncing around 0 VU on the loudest bits. In the reference example, you've chosen to use automation of the gain to adjust how hard you hit the limiter. But in this case, prior to automation, did you set the mastering level for the loud bits and increase the gain in the quieter section of the song to bring up the overall level, or set the mastering level for the quieter section and then automate the gain reduction for the latter half? I've been practicing with a friend's mix where I also wish to raise the first half of the song to be closer to the later, louder section because it seemed too quiet, but not lose all the dynamics in the piece in doing so. So this part of the vid was particularly interesting. However, now I'm unsure where you set your mastering level initially. Could you elaborate, please? So there's 2 things. There's the mastering level, meaning the loudness on the meters in the digital audio file, and then there's the mastering level, meaning the monitoring level that you set to get feedback in the room. So my recommendation for the measured level is VU at -10 or -11, which is roughly equivalent to -10 or -11 short-term LUFS. You don't have to go with that. You could, lots of stuff out there is mastered up at -8, -7. I don't recommend it, but if that's what you want to compete with, then that's where your meters need to be calibrated. So you'd set the VU to -7, -8-ish. Or you might find, as I say, and lots of people email me and they say, well, I bring my reference tracks in and they were things from the 70s or 80s. And when I bring them up so that they, with the VU calibrated at -11, with it kind of averaging around 0 and pushing up, I'm getting lots of clipping. And that means that they were mastered originally at a lower level and peaking up near 0. So in the process of bringing the level up, you're inducing that clipping. So in that case, you have to choose, do you want to go for the loudness level that they have, or the loudness level that I recommend, or something else? And if you want to go for my mastering level but use them as references, you're going to have to either put up with the clipping, which may not be disastrous, to be honest, if depending on what it is that's clipping and why, in terms of using it as a reference track, or you might choose to put a limiter on there. The disadvantage of that is that that's not the original sound of the masters. So that's the level that you choose in the DAW. Once you've decided that, and you've got your reference tracks at that level, whatever it might be. So if you're going with my recommendation, averaging around -11 on the VU, or 0 with the VU calibrated to -11, then you adjust your monitoring gain so that so that the loudest bits sound really big and exciting and loud enough to you, but not so loud that they kind of, you get ear fatigue. Personally, I'm really sensitive to it. Occasionally I've tried, either the monitoring setting has been knocked, or I've experimented with things, and if I go maybe a dB quieter with the monitoring level, I end up pushing things harder than I intend to and getting higher levels in the master. If I have it set to high, then I tend to not push things as hard, but I find I do start to then get ear fatigue for the loudest sections. I mean, that's just me. Everybody's different. So all of this stuff is a very much a personal thing. What is your goal in terms of the level, the measured level, and then how loud do you like to listen to it in the room? So then, to answer Rob's question, or Robbie, I think it is, in terms of automating the level for the different sections of the song, do I set the loudest section or the quietest section first? Yes. Meaning either. Often I will I'll be listening to a song, it'll be playing through, there'll be a quiet section, I'll be messing around with the EQ, have the level more or less where it is, it'll get to the loudest section, I'll adjust, and then I'll probably start looping around the loudest section to choose my final settings. And at that stage, then if I go back to the beginning and it then sounds too quiet, that will be the level that I want to lift up. But it doesn't really matter. It could be that I focus on the quiet section because that's the bit that kind of catches my attention or my imagination or whatever. And so I have that so that I'm happy with it, and then it hits the loud section and it's either sounding too loud or pushing too hard against the compression or the limiting or whatever. So, and then at that stage I would reduce that section or increase it perhaps if it needs more impact or whatever, but the tweak, so it's basically relative to whatever it was I was focusing on before I decided I needed to make the change. So I tend to think, mastering for me is very much like a layers of an onion thing. You have this scraggy old onion, you pull off the outer layer and it looks a lot better, and you pull off another layer and it really looks a lot better, and then you're into the little blemishes. So for me, it's the outer layer is just whatever catches my attention first. Was there too much bass? Was there not enough bass? Was there a resonance at some particular frequency or some particular frequency range where it was lacking? I just go for whatever jumps out at me first, deal with that, and then kind of move on. And just, it's that same loop that I described in the first video of refining it every time and hopefully honing in on a final result. So hopefully that answers Robbie's question. I realize that the whole mastering level thing is on the one hand, I'm making a big deal of it. On the other hand, the guidelines might seem horribly vague, but it's, I know there are people taking the course who are aiming for kind of Dark Side of the Moon reference levels and who are aiming for Skrillex levels. So I can't cater for all of those. The reason that I choose the levels I do are in terms of recommendations, this whole -11 thing, which is, by the way, basically the same as the -10 recommendation from the original course, but taking into account the fact that nowadays I would suggest having a -1 ceiling on the peaks. Back in the day, it was -0.3 because that was the best advice we had, but that was before everything was being streamed. And honestly, before I really fully understood or had investigated the whole effect of intersample peaks for myself. So these days I recommend -1 for the peaks, but therefore -11 for the loudness, so you keep that same peak to loudness ratio. And yeah, in terms of what the actual loudness is, that's very much a personal thing that everybody's going to have to decide for themselves.
What's yours, Ian?
What's
your listening level? Like what's your dB level of what you're actually kind of in your room?
Well, according to an app whose name I can never remember, it's so intuitive. Actually, I do vaguely remember. It starts with SPL. There we go. SPLNFFT.
Oh,
Which
okay.
I guess is SPL, and so. But that's an iPhone app, and here it is. And you can. I don't know whether you can. Where's the window? Yeah, you can see it responding to my voice. I have no idea how accurate that is. The mic on this is going to be very far from a calibrated reference mic, but using that and the DBC setting, when the music is kind of hitting 0 VU, that's about 80 dB
Right.
SPL on this thing. And the C weighting is the one that's supposed to emulate the ear, so it assigns more significance, I think, to the upper mid range. It's a bit like an LUFS kind of a thing, and that will then peak up to maybe 85 or 86 for the really loud stuff. But it's not typically that loud for that long, for what it's worth. But I mean, I know people who say that that's way too loud or way too quiet. You'll see 86, but that's what so if I put pink noise through the system at -14, yeah, which is calibrated, used to be calibrated as 0 VU when I started mastering, but these days will come up as +3 because I'm calibrated to -11. That pink noise at -14 RMS or LFS, whichever way you like to do it, is measuring, I think, 80-ish on this from memory. Which makes sense, right? Because that's my kind of ticking over level. And you often see a recommendation for 86, and I think 86 is mentioned in the Dolby specs somewhere, that kind of thing. I just find that too loud, and I think most people do. Probably more suitable for mixing. I mean, a 6 dB offset between mixing, what would that be? You're kind of going from, if I'm mastering at -11 LUFS, that would take you down to -18. There you go. So probably 86 is not such a bad idea for kind of ballpark, but all of these things are just starting points because it depends so much on, I have heard that women are more sensitive to frequency, to especially upper mids, and that's borne out by my wife, who's much more sensitive to distortion than I am. Often she'll complain about things that are distorted before I do. I mean, that's just anecdotal, but if that's accurate, then obviously if you're a female mastering engineer, then you would probably have a different opinion about what is and isn't acceptable in terms of monitoring levels, and maybe the degree of distortion. It's probably an interesting decrease research for some student somewhere at that stage watching. Anyway.
The reason why I asked is because I found that 80 sort of, I've seen 85 sort of, bandied about as like a good starting point, and I just find it way too loud. Like but I'm worried that if I'm listening, because I find sort of, like 70, 75 a lot more comfortable to work in, but am I going to be missing out listening at that level? Am I going to be not hearing stuff I should be hearing if I'm listening like 10 dBs lower than that, lower than 85?
Not well. I mean, so my dimmed level is 12 dB below 80, right? So that would make my dimmed level 68 or whatever it is. That's probably, I think there is a risk that you would miss stuff if you worked at that level only, I think. And that's why I flip between the two, but I do quite a lot of work with the monitoring dimmed. Maybe I don't know, I'd guess perhaps 50% of the time. And if you have good monitoring, then it shouldn't stop you hearing things. It's just a kind of a different perspective. So I mean, whatever works, I think. I think it's just for example, the whole Fletcher Munson thing of us hearing more bass and treble at higher levels. If you're used to working at at 70 dB SPL, say, and then you lift it up by 10 dBs sometimes, that's going to have a big effect on how you perceive the high and the low end, which will have a big effect on how you perceive the EQ, but also will make things like clicks and high frequency distortion more audible, because those upper frequencies are going to, your ear's going to pick them out more. But especially if you work on headphones, or if you have a pair of headphones that you use for referencing, that wouldn't be a problem. So, I wouldn't be concerned if it's working for you. I think it's definitely worth checking it loud as well.
Yeah.
There's, but now let me think which way. I forget which way around this is. I tend to EQ at full level, and then when I'm fine tuning loudness differences, I'll often dim. So I'll often be working on a song initially at full level, get it to where I think it's about right, and then hit dim and start flicking between the other songs and tweak the loudness level of the new song, and then go back to full level and see how it feels. That's not anything I have a particular theory about. It's just something I've noticed about what I tend to do. So that may or may not be useful.
I guess people aren't going to be listening to music generally at 85 dB, are they? In a normal real life situation.
No, I mean, that's pretty loud. I mean, I maybe on earbuds, but perhaps, I don't know what the measured SPLs kind of come out at when you do that. But certainly not in a, it's loud enough to annoy the neighbors. So probably most people don't listen casually at that level for long periods of time or all the time. But I mean, again, I don't think that's really, I think the issue, like you say, is can you hear everything? And the point about the the Fletcher Munson curve, the equal loudness curve, is that at the whatever level it is, the response of our ear is flattest. It's never flat, but it's flattest. So as mastering engineers, if our goal is to have neutral monitoring, and to master things so that they sound balanced in a neutral space, so that if they then go out into the world and get played on Beats headphones or Apple earbuds or whatever it is, they're going to sound right, then we should also have the level at that level, the monitoring level at that kind of ballpark as well. On the other hand, if you're using reference tracks and you've learned what things sound like and things translate when you take them out into the world, then that's going to work as well. I'm just going to check. I've got a couple of extra questions here. Okay, I'll come back to that one. Okay, so Rob is Bring Me Sunshine. Okay, or Robbie, thank you. Man Mansion, I don't know what your name is in the course. You could maybe let me know, but I'll come to your question. Well, no, I'll do what I said I did, which is if I get a question from somebody who's here live, I'll answer. I've got a mix that's very dynamic and contains several sections that drop to 5 in dynameter. Should I try and expand the dynamic range of these? I would, but that's just me. And you say mix, does that mean mix or does it mean master? Because if it's a mix, I definitely would. I feel like, depending on what it is. If it's, okay, yes, I should rewind. If it's flute or a sustained organ sound or string pads or string parts or something else where it's not got a low score because the loudness is very high, that's just the intrinsic score of the piece, then no, don't worry about that. Especially if let's say you have a mix where it's kind of all looking kind of normal and then all the percussion drops out, then you will see the PSR value in dynameter, the peak to loudness ratio, short term, for anybody else who hasn't got the meter, drop. That doesn't mean it's super crushed. It just means the instruments that were making it look wider have dropped out of the arrangement. But if it is a section where, if you're going from a quiet section where you've got a wider PSR, and then it's getting squashed during the loud bits, in a master, I would say for me 5 is about 3 dBs too little, and in a mix, having said all of that, if it sounds great to you and you're happy with it, it's all good. It's just that in my experience, there's never really any benefit in pushing it harder than that. If you've got a master that is hitting minimum PSR of 8 in the loud sections, there's a good chance it's already going to be turned down 2 or 3 dBs on YouTube and Spotify and everywhere else. That'll increase to 6 or 7 dBs if it pushes down to 5. To me, that's just a potential missed opportunity. So I think what I would say is do the experiment. Try easing the levels back, see how it sounds. Do an alternative master or mix where things are more dynamic, loudness match it and compare it and see how you feel. See whether you like the result. And I can see some extras. Tim, hi. Says it's mainly strings. Spot on. Okay, so right, that probably is. And James says, I've experienced this on a piano vocal when the vocalist holds a note for an extended period of time. Absolutely. There's one of the examples I used on the compression course is a beautiful folk tune, and the PSR or the reading on Dynameter drops very low in that during exactly that sustained vocal notes. These are very pure sounds. They don't really have any dynamic content in them originally. So the question is, when you're watching Dynameter, is it coinciding with a really loud bit, or is it just an arrangement thing? If it's just an arrangement thing, no, you don't need to worry. I wrote a blog post a while back about especially EDM. If you're producing loads of stuff with lots of samples or preset synth sounds or whatever, a lot of those will be heavily compressed and limited beforehand. So that without using any compression or limiting, you might find that you're seeing low dynamics readings in the piece. Again, that's not a symptom of it being over squashed. That's just the way that it is. That doesn't mean it might not be interesting to add something more dynamic in, like say a recording of a real shaker or some other percussion instrument, just to add a little bit of that extra variety and interest to it. Or that might be absolutely the wrong thing to do, and you wouldn't do it at all. So yeah, definitely not should, but I tend to think of it. It's like a warning. It's like when the red peak lights come on. Or the VU meters pin or whatever it is. It's a kind of a sign that you should kind of go, oh, hang on, why is that happening? Is that okay? Am I happy with that musically? Yes. Okay, good. Or no. Okay, maybe there's something to address. Hopefully that helps. Let's go back to the questions. Martin, when you're using the multiband compressor on the low end, doesn't that just turn the low end down again that you just boosted up with the EQ? I'm not seeing you do anything with makeup gain, or is the compressor set up for auto makeup gain somehow? I understand it probably just turns the peaks down, but maybe you can elaborate a bit on that, and also perhaps have some suggestions for setting or using makeup gain at all on multiband compressors. So, yes, Martin, it's just turning down, I won't say peaks because peak gets confused with peak level, but the louder bits of the bass range. So imagine you have a bass line where one string is louder than the other. So it's kind of going do 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 do, and the do 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 is singing out. If I run that into a multiband compressor, the do 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 will probably stay below the threshold, and then the do 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 goes above the threshold and gets pulled back. So it's evening out the bass balance. Same thing might happen if I put a big low frequency boost into the kick drum, which is something I like to do quite often. That's a nice way of getting some sub into the sound. That sub would overwhelm everything in the mix if it wasn't then managed by the multiband compressor. So it's kind of like a crude way of only compressing one instrument if the frequency distributions work out. I honestly can't remember whether the Melder multiband has makeup gain in it. These days I'm using the Fab filter a lot, which the TC multiband that I like does have auto makeup gain built in, but I think it doesn't really matter, because if you imagine I have one with auto makeup gain built in, what that means is as I wind the threshold down and you're going to get more compression out, it automatically lifts the level up to compensate for any apparent reduction in volume. But since I start with all the bands equal and tend to keep all the bands equal except in special cases, it kind of doesn't matter that the makeup gain is there. What I would say is I tend to have the gain structured, and in fact actually this relates to a question that somebody else asked. Brett, I have a question about using the gain plugin to turn the track up and down. Why not just use the fader? Is there a reason I should use the gain plugin instead of a fader to turn the track up and down? Part one of the answer to that question, Brett, is because often the fader is post insert. So if you have compression and EQ and any other dynamics set up as an insert on the channel and you push the fader up, quite often you're lifting the level afterwards. And my goal when I'm boosting the gain is to boost it into the compressor. Now you might be able to set that in a DAW, or maybe the DAW does the fader pre-insert anyway, but that's one reason to do it as a separate gain plugin. The other reason is to get the gain up independent of the other processing, and this is where it relates to Martin's question. Imagine you have an EQ module and you use the input gain to lift it up by 3 dBs. That's fine. There's no reason not to do that. That's what the input gain is there for. But then when you bypass that EQ module, regardless of any other changes, the level will drop by 3 dBs. And immediately there's the risk that you're going to be deceived by the loudness. Chances are the version plus, even if you left the EQ flat, the version with +3 will sound better because of the Fletcher-Munson effect and the whole louder is better thing. Whereas if you have that +3 added with a gain plugin prior to that EQ module, then if you have no EQ in the EQ module and you bypass it, you'll hear no change. That's an accurate reflection. If you use a few subtle cuts tend to affect our perception of loudness less than boosts. I can't remember why, but it's true. And it's one of the reasons people often recommend cutting, not boosting. You'll have seen me boost a lot, so don't worry about that, but it's just interesting. But if you have a few gentle cuts and then you bypass the EQ, the loudness will change slightly, but probably not that much. And without using loudness matching by hand or perception, it just means you're getting more. It's a quick, you kind of, oh, here that EQ seems to work. Quickly hit bypass. Oh yeah, okay. You don't have that extra 3 dB change or whatever involved. And that's the way I like to have it in general. Is I would like to set the gain at the beginning of the chain. And first in the process, because that way, if all it needs is a gain lift, maybe you push it up by 4 dBs and you think, well, it sounds fantastic in comparison to everything else. So job done. That's minimalist mastering. I'm very happy with that. That's the way I would like to work, rather than dialing in a ton of EQ, then turning it up, having to adjust the EQ because the level boost changed the way you felt about it in the first place, and then ending up with who knows what. So going back to the multiband thing from Martin's question, the way that I like to have it set up is that if I bypass the multiband, I don't get a big gain change. So, and that could be achieved either with automatic makeup gain or just the overall gain settings or the gain structure. It doesn't really matter. If you then dial in separate thresholds on different bands of the multiband compressor to achieve some kind of effect, then you'd have to be careful whether it's got makeup gain or not, and maybe set it manually if you hear the level of that band reducing. But again, rather than do that, I like to just push more or less EQ in. So because it's more precision, right? Let's say you've got a low band that crosses over at 100 Hertz. If I just wind the threshold down, that's basically like using a low shelf at 100 Hertz to push that, if there's automatic makeup gain or if you do it by hand, to just push the level of that band up. Whereas if I want a low throughout shelf crossing over at 100 Hertz, I can dial that in on the EQ. What I'm more likely to want is a parametric at 40, 50, 60 Hertz or a notch at 80 Hertz or whatever it might be. I can be much more precise with that EQ. Boosting that EQ will increase the amount of dynamics processing in that band. But the point is it's dynamic, right? It's not like I add 3 dBs of gain and that gets taken away. If you think about the kick drum sound, it's like if I add a boost at 40 Hertz, that hits the compressor, it probably punches through because of the long attack time in the compressor. So you hear some of that sub, then the gain will get pulled back. So some of that sub will disappear or be pulled back, and then it'll relax and it'll come back again. What that means is I can probably go with a bigger sub boost than I would be able to without the compression, but I'll end up with a more even result. and a thicker, fuller kick drum sound as a result. Hopefully that helps. That's a pretty long-winded answer to 2 questions, but I'll go back to the chat and see if there's any questions about that. The other thing just to say before I leave Martin's question is, he says he's experimenting following the course using the TC Finalizer application, which he finds very interesting because it has automatic level matching of the mastered and unmastered versions and innovative visuals and visualizations and things. I'm pretty curious about that. I haven't been able to try it because the version of OS X I'm running is too old, but I am planning to install a more recent version of OS X, and at that point I will be playing around with the Finalizer because I love the older the hardware implementations of the TC stuff, and I have actually talked to the TC engineers about this, and from what I hear, the processing is an advancement on what they had back then. I suspect that the app isn't going to give me enough control in its current form anyway, but I'm very curious to try it. So Martin, I'd be interested to kind of hear your verdict on it, if you have one. Right, let me check the chat. Lost the window. That cup is a very strange wine glass. I mean this? It's a cut glass brandy glass, which I inherited from my grandparents. Does the job. You mentioned in one vid about leaving the first band of your EQ for high pass filters, but how often do you find yourself doing that? How often do I? Well, so one thing is, the nice thing about the Fab filter and lots of modern EQs is you can add many more bands as you need. How often do I end up high pass filtering? When it's necessary. I don't know, maybe 1 in 10, What I tend to find is that usually a particular project will have some kind of project problem that needs the low bass sorting out. Probably that the client didn't have monitoring that was revealing to them that they had a lot of extra sub energy floating around. But I mean, a classic thing would be if I'm boosting that sub in a kick drum to try and get some real depth into the kick drum sound, and then it all just kind of gets flabby and out of control. So that's, maybe they did have the monitoring to hear it, but they just weren't applying the same EQ that I am. And what I'm doing in mastering is revealing extra problems. And in that case, what I find is that high pass filter, low cut filter, if you can take some of that kind of wild, out of control energy out of the low end, you can get a cleaner, punchier result whilst still boosting quite heavily, perhaps potentially. So yeah, I still do it fairly often, but it would tend to usually be, oh, okay, this client, this project, we have some problems with the low end. It's fairly unusual to sort of just drop it in for the odd. I say that, I think there have been a few albums I've done recently where I've only used it on a few songs. So I mean, again, it depends on the arrangement and the, all the rest of it, especially if somebody's using samples. If somebody's mic'd up a real drum kit, if there's a problem, it'll probably be a problem for all the songs that used that setup. Whereas if somebody is pulling in different kick drum samples from song to song, then it could vary all over the place. So, but yeah, I don't worry too much about leaving the bands free at this point, because most EQs these days will give you at least 6 bands, which should be ample. I mean, the other thing is, especially on the Fab filter, you can make any of the EQ nodes into a high pass filter, but I prefer it to be number 1 because I'm slightly OCD that way. So you can ignore that. I've lost my questions. Where did I put them? Oh, there we go. Okay, Michael had lots of questions about limiters, a lot of which were very specific. I'm going to give a more general reply about how I use limiters in general, which I hope will be helpful, Michael, and to you guys as well. So a lot of Michael's questions were, well, this limiter had a clean setting and that one had a punchy setting. What's the difference? How did you choose between them? How do the attack and release times of this limiter relate to the settings in that one, all that, those kind of questions. And he's basically asking, taking a step back, how do I choose which limiter to use? How do I choose which settings to have on that limiter? And also, you don't see me tweaking them that often. Why is that? So I think the first thing to say is I don't care that much which limiter I'm using. I do care a bit in that there are some that I don't like or that I tend not to use. But overall, the reason I say that is I'm trying to use them as little as possible. So you've seen on the course, what I'm suggesting is compression first, then limiting. Compression tends to have long attack times. Limiters tend to have short attack times. What that means is that the compression is generally dealing with what I would call the body of the sound, the note of the sound, whereas the limiter is then just dealing with any transients that are left over. What that means is that often the limiter doesn't have to work as hard, and even if it does work hard, it's only dealing with transients which they're designed to do and be very clean at doing. So whichever limiter I use is probably going to impart... Stephen, I'm just going to mute you because of your background noise.
I'm so sorry.
Adorable as it is. So it means the limiter can work cleanly and less aggressively, and whereas the compressor is handling all the kind of meat. By contrast, if you bypassed a compressor and tried to achieve a lot of the levels that I'm showing in the course, and certainly any louder, using just a limiter, you'll find that the limiter is much too aggressive to cut into the body of the sound. If you have a limiter doing gain reduction on a bass or a vocal or whatever, it's going to sound weird. It's probably going to sound bad. It could even sound distorted or, kind of mangled in some way. So yeah, as a rule of thumb, the way that I work, even if you see quite big numbers on the limiter in terms of like 4 or 5 dBs of gain reduction, it'll be very brief and it'll sound very clean. So that's one reason I don't care so much, given that I'm not giving the limiter too much to do. The sonic differences between them kind of becomes less important. Having said that, I mean, if you take the FabFilter, it's got 4 presets, and I often start with the punchy one. And that's just my preference. And if a limiter or any plugin is going to give me a bunch of settings, presets, I will probably flick through them and use whichever one I like best as a starting point. If I'm choosing reverb, I have a couple of different types of reverb that tend to have sounds that I like. I will often, and one of them is the TC Electronic VSS3, if you're interested, for kind of natural acoustic reverbs. It's fantastic. And one of the first things I do is just audition a bunch of presets, and I kind of go, oh, that one's okay, that one's okay. And then I will tweak the presets further to get the final sound that I like. In terms of limiters with the FabFilter, a lot of the time I'm happy with the punchy preset. I actually think that might be because it has a little degree of soft clipping built into it. Somebody was talking about it and mentioned that. I haven't investigated that. This is, I'll come back to that point in a second. But there are still times when I add other soft clipping in to get a more aggressive sound. And as I discuss at some point in the course, the trade-off you have there is the more soft clipping you have, the more distortion you have, but the less pumping you have, and therefore you can get a more apparently aggressive sound, providing it doesn't push too far and make it sound distorted. So the limiter's not doing that much. And I get bored agonizing over the settings. I mean, I guess it's possible that there are times when if I was to tweak the limiter, I would find other ways. But this is another thing. In general, I mean, I genuinely believe, I say it on the course a lot, it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. The classic example I always think of was way back in my career when I worked at SRT. You'd get the opportunity to work on a live album, and it could be a live album where actually it was a compilation of stuff from many, many years, so spanning. And the challenge with that is that if you're trying to create, I like to have a seamless run of audience sound through a live album. I'm not a fan of the kind of fade up live song, fade out again. So I would like to create a false impression of continuity between these songs, even if they were taken from multiple years, rightly or wrongly. which means that you have to get really creative with the crossfades, because quite often you'd be going from a full stadium gig with the audience going wild into maybe a small club where it's, you know, they've just been tuning their instruments and stuff and things have died down. It's a real interesting challenge to try and get that to work and sound convincing. And what would typically happen is you'd have a particularly tricky one. You kind of go, well, I think that works. And then you'd go and get a colleague to come in and listen. And always the colleague would go, that's good, but let me do this. And they'd spend about 5 or 10 minutes tweaking and come up with something that looks, in terms of the crossfades and the gain structure and all the rest of it, something completely different. And you listen to it and you kind of go, okay, yeah, I hear what you did there. I've never actually done this, but I'm pretty sure that the results are very, very similar. Editing just seems to be this particular thing where people can achieve very similar things with very different strategies in terms of the way the final result sounds. And I think that applies across the board. You give me 4 different EQs and a song to master. I will make each of those EQs give me a result that I'm happy with, possibly in completely different ways, depending on how they work. And the results will not be very different. You know, same with compression and the same with limiting. It's also like the, you know, there are people who have 5 or 6 different limiters or types of dither or brands of compressor that they use, and they constantly audition different ones to find the one that's right for a particular situation. Whereas I'm more likely to go with the one that I use all the time and just obsessively tweak the EQ details till I get the result that I want. I'm not saying either one is right or wrong. It's just 2 different ways of achieving the same thing. For me, it's better to have really in-depth knowledge of a kind of more limited tool set than to have a massive rank of kind of plug-in choices or gear choices and all the rest of it. But that's just my preference, and that's the way I was trained. You know, when I started out 25 odd years ago, the M5000, the TC Electronic M5000, which was the big brother of the Finalizer, which came out a few years later, we had one of the, I mean, they were £20,000 or something for this box. So you, especially in a mastering situation, you didn't have multiple, at least not at the studio where I worked, you didn't have a whole room full of things to choose between. You had 3 or 4 bits of gear that were really carefully chosen in order to enable you to get the results that you wanted. And that's kind of persisted through to my working methods and my ethos to this day. So in terms of limiter, it's not that I don't care. I don't mean that literally. I really like the Fab Filter. I really like the TC limiter. I'm not such a fan of the Ozone limiter. I haven't experimented with all the different settings as much because life is too short. But when I have used it in the past, I have found that actually for me it's too clean. I think I mentioned in one of the videos here that I like the TC limiter and the fact that it's working quite hard, and I like that I can hear it working a bit. Same thing applies with the Fab Filter. When a limiter is too clean, the temptation is to just push and push and push and push. And it kind of sounds okay, and then you bypass it and you think, whoa, you know, what did I lose? Loudness matched, of course. Because it's taken out all of those things. Whereas if you have one that starts to react when you push it hard, that kind of gives you a feeling of what you're pushing against, and I feel like that interaction can be helpful sometimes. So, you know, I mean, again, it's just me. It's just the way that I work. And attack and release times in the same way. I mean, I do change attack and release times on compression particularly. I don't mess around with it too much on limiting, but in compression it can be, I just did an album where I had to increase the attack time most of the time to keep the same amount of punch in the drums. But I think it has less impact than people think. It's more about what is the EQ, how hard are you pushing things, in my experience. Your mileage may vary. But hopefully that helps Michael in terms of explaining the so okay, just to come back to another aspect of your question, you know, in terms of there is no translation. I mean, so with limiters, especially with things like output ceiling, threshold, and whether or not they have input gain and what happens when you tweak each of those. So if you take the waves, L1 limiter, kind of classic old plug-in limiter, as you pull the threshold down, it applies automatic makeup gain so the level goes up. That kind of harks back to a time when we didn't have floating point as a matter of course in all DAWs, especially not in Pro Tools. So that if you pushed the input gain to the limiter, you could clip it before it hit the limiter. So you could have it peaking 3 dBs above zero going into the limiter. Those would get shaved off. The limiter would never do anything. Whereas if you have it 3 dBs down and you pull the threshold down and it lifts the level up by 3 dBs, then the limiter will behave as intended. That's just a different way of working than the fab filter, where you have an input gain fader and you push that up to increase the amount of limiting. I don't actually do that. I push the level up way back in the chain, allow the floating point to handle all of the peaks above zero, and the limiter will still do its job. Again, neither one is right or wrong, but it means that it's very hard to translate the settings on one limiter to another. Some of them you need a -1 threshold to get any limiting happening at all. Some of them you need a minus, and if you do that, what then happens to the peaks? If you pull the threshold down to -1, does that limit the output peaks to -1, or does it take the output gain down by a dB? And unfortunately, it's different between all of them. You just have to, if you want to do kind of shootouts and testing, you're going to have to really dig into the settings and figure out what happens in every case. So the fab filter, for example, when you take the output ceiling down by -1, the output level goes down by -1. So if you wanted unity gain through the fab filter, you would put an input gain of +1. So yeah, they're all a bit different, and it's a bit of a lottery. In terms of the things like clean versus punchy versus, all bets are off. Those are just names chosen by the manufacturers. They may or may not translate to what we hear. The default setting on the Pro L, I think, is all round, which I think doesn't sound good on quite a lot of things. I'm not interested in the sound that it gives me. It doesn't do what I expect it to do. But what I expect it to do is based on a preconception that came from limiters that I've used in the past. So again, it's all going to vary. It's all going to be a personal thing. But yeah, I find it hard to get excited about comparing different limiters. I do it in the home mastering, compression and limiting videos because I know that people expect that, and I think it's useful to see them, for you guys to see me going through that process and trying to make the comparisons. But I don't. It's far more beneficial to spend another 5 or 10 minutes tweaking the EQ on something than it is, I think, to swap out the limiter, unless there's something really not happening with the limiter. And I see a question here: would you use a clipper? Yes, I would. And the reason I would use it is if the limiting sounds too clean. It's like that ozone thing where I'm pushing the level up. The loudness is kind of where it is, and it all just sounds a little bit tame, and maybe everything's a little bit soft and not hitting quite hard enough. At that point, I might experiment with a clipper. What I tend to do is set them with the output of the clipper up and the input a bit down, so that I'm not just, because if you just insert a clipper, you're basically replacing, you're limiting, or you're not limiting, you're clipping everything to zero peak, and therefore the limiter's not going to do anything. Whereas if you turn the output gain of the clipper up a little bit and the input gain down, you can share the load. You can have a couple of dBs of clipping happening and a couple of dBs limiting happening, and that's often a nice place to be if you're going for a more aggressive sound, if it doesn't introduce distortion that you don't like. That's the kind of situation where I would use the clipper. If you haven't already come across it, Tim, there's a point in the course where I talk about that and point you at a video that I did kind of comparing clipping and the different sounds that they give, so that you might find that helpful. And James says, okay, there you go. I've been amazed by the sonic difference of tweaking the look ahead on the Fab Filter Pro L2. Okay, so look ahead. Michael had a question about this as well, which I tried to answer via email, but since you brought it up, James, so look ahead is not really a look ahead. It's basically a delay. It's if you imagine an extreme example, if the limiter added a second of delay, so it hits the input and then there's a second before you hear the output, that second is then stored, and in the time that the limiter is not playing it back to you, it can analyze and do whatever it likes to the signal. So then when it starts playing it back, you're starting at time 0, but you can have limiting applied if you would like at time 0 based on what happens in the next second. so that it's like the limiter is able to look ahead in time. Now, typically the delays are much shorter. They're kind of a few hundred milliseconds, and that's enough time for the limiter, in theory, to do something much more intelligent and musical than without it. I've yet to be impressed. Having said that, I haven't really played in that much detail with the FabFilter, so maybe, actually, James, drop a comment in. Do you think it's a good thing having extra look ahead in the Pro L? And what do you think it does? Because maybe this is an experiment I need to do. Because, okay, there's another element to this whole thing, right? All of this stuff about gear and choosing things and shooting. A lot of my work is just doing work for clients, and that's about getting them the result that they want. And so in any given day, I kind of have to go, well, is my time better spent shooting out another 2 or 3 alternatives of this, that, the other, and experimenting to learn this new piece of processing or the rest of it, or should I just get on and focus on getting a result for the client? So I haven't experimented with the look ahead in the Pro L, not because I'm not interested, although it actually hadn't occurred to me to test it, because I've generally been so unimpressed by look ahead in general. But if anybody can do it well, then FabFilter can. But it's just kind of like, well, I've got work to do. Yeah, I'd be interested to, if you're still here, to know what you think the benefits are, James. I've yet to hear a look ahead I was particularly impressed by. In theory, it should enable you to do super intelligent, clever things. They often don't sound that musical to me. We're used to a real-time world. If you go into a gig and it goes from a very quiet section to a very dynamic section, your ears, the muscles in your ears will tighten up to protect your eardrums, but it takes a certain amount of time. We're kind of used to reacting to things in real time, and I think the same thing applies with musical processing for me. I think if the limiter is able to start pulling the level back before something happens, it maybe doesn't sound natural. That's kind of generally my kind of objection to it. I try these things and I kind of think, well, it's interesting because it's kind of cleaner, or it's less colored, or whatever it might be, but it doesn't quite sound right. Oh, I thought that was a reply from James, but he hasn't replied yet. So yeah, I think that's, that's my feeling about it, look ahead, but maybe I should do some experimenting with the Pro L. And Vlad has just asked, he says, unfortunately, I didn't have time to start the course yet. The only question I have is, when do you plan to have another Q&A? That depends on how many questions, Vlad. The last time I ran the course, I only had enough questions to make it worthwhile to do one Q&A. But if there are a ton more questions, I mean, if I don't do a second Q&A, I'll always try and reply to questions by email. And if I get enough that it's worth doing another Q&A, then I'll do another one. Probably typically it takes 2 or 3 weeks to kind of build up enough questions, because people can't always attend live. So it's good to have otherwise it's like, hello, oh, here's the answer to this question, and that's it, which is a bit silly. Yeah. So probably in another few weeks, but by all means, send the questions in anyway. I can't promise to answer questions once the course is over, but I do try, depending on my other commitments. Yeah, hopefully I can get you an answer. And particularly if you can drop it into the Facebook group, that's kind of tends to be active most of the time. So even if you are not able to tackle the course before it, and we've still got, this is only week 3, so there's a bonus week that you guys don't know about yet. So there's at least another 6 weeks left. So hopefully there's plenty of time for you. But send the questions in anyway, and we'll try and get them answered one way or another. So that's all the questions that I have been asked, and we've been going for about an hour, which is a good length for a Q&A. So unless anybody else here wants to drop any more questions into the comments box, or Stephen, you had any kind of follow-up on anything that I've said recently?
No, the only thing I tried to ask a question. I don't really know how this works. I was just going to ask you about hardware emulations, because I mean, we talk about FabFilter so much because the stuff's amazing, and I was just wondering, in like real, like actual mastering situations where you're actually working, not to make a video and do demonstrations and all that sort of stuff. Do you ever actually use hardware emulations of compressors or EQs or anything like that?
Not often. I was going to just say no, but I don't think it's quite that clear. I mean, for example, I've just been doing a video for Waves on using the Abbey Road plugin, which hopefully will be out sometime soon. And my kind of conclusion at the end of that is it is perfectly usable, at least in combination with the True Peak limiter right at the end of the chain. And you can get good results with it.
Is that the Abbey Road, the mastering chain?
That's the TG
thing?
mastering chain, yeah.
Yeah.
Would I wouldn't want that to be my only chain, my only choice. It's like, I mean, not enough flexibility in the EQ, too much distortion, and not enough flexibility in the dynamics setting, all kinds of reasons. But it could be a nice flavor to add sometimes. So but I think because one of the things for me is coming up, I forget which week of the course it is, there's a video where I'm mastering a metal tune, and actually one of the comments I have, it sounds a bit clean. I think a little bit too clean, and so I go into using the saturation section in Ozone to just mess the sound up a little bit and get a little bit more aggression in there. That's the kind of thing that I might use a hardware emulation for, where I'm looking for that. But I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I was trained using digital gear. When I started out, digital was the new big thing. So having DDD on your CD, meaning digitally mixed, recorded, mixed, and mastered, was seen as a positive. And we kind of come full circle at this point where people don't feel that way. But I've probably, because that's the way I've trained. That's the way I kind of, I always had. I mean, back then, having 4 bands of completely parametric EQ was a real luxury. And having digital limiting and digital multiband compression, all of that stuff was an amazing luxury. So I just kind of saw all of that as a positive, and that was really part of the process of learning how to do this stuff. So coming from that sort of situation to then offer me the opportunity of, I don't know, using a Fairchild compressor instead, or an 1176 or whatever, where you've got much more limited feature set. You have to go out to analog and back in again from digital, the possible degradation caused by that. All the rest of it, it kind of just feels a bit illogical to me, because I can emulate the sound or the settings of those things if I want it. If I want a really fast attack time, I can just dial one in. For example, having said that, when I was mixing back then, I would quite often hire bits of valve tube gear to get a little bit of that character in when I was mixing and things. So, and it was very nice to have those things. I mean, and then the other thing, there's the whole thing of, I guess part of it, I'm slightly biased by just the perception. It's like if I actually had a Fairchild to play with, I would probably experiment with it and end up using it quite a lot. Whereas I've got 6 or 7 emulations of Fairchilds. I've never done the shootout myself, but people I trust tell me that the differences are marginal. It won't sound exactly like that Fairchild, but it will have enough of the qualities of that to be useful. But even so, I kind of feel like it's not the real thing, so I shouldn't use it. And that's a purely kind of sort of subjective, preconception in my head, rather than really based on anything realistic. I wouldn't hesitate to use, and I use others. I mean, so Irk Sound make a thing called Soothe, which is this kind of almost like an automatic de-esser that will operate on any kind of frequency band in the range that you give it, and it can be great for sorting out something that's kind of really harsh and metallic sounding. That's a way more aggressive piece of processing than most analog bits of kit. I wouldn't hesitate to use that if I thought that the master needed it or benefited from it. If I had an analog box that did it, I don't know whether I would. It's a strange. I'm rambling now. Um, I think so. Yeah, the answer is I don't often use them, but I wonder whether part of that is to do with my preconceptions about the idea of a plug-in emulation. Even though I'm one of the first people to argue that there's nothing special about analog gear, particularly. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, electronics is not that complicated. There's not kind of magic and voodoo built into these bits of analog hardware. They just, you know, they're kind of complicated and have imperfections and flaws and variations in components and stuff that make them kind of interesting. I mean, they're lovely to have. I mean, you know, I've mixed on Neve and SSL consoles, and just simple stuff like using a Studer tape machine and seeing the tape kind of start and stop, the engineering precision. It's a pleasure to use them. So it's like if you have them and you enjoy using them, I don't see a reason why not to. But plug-in emulations of them, I think in the end it comes down to me being a control freak. Is just this: why would I use an emulation of a Pultec EQ? You know, I mean, often I will have an EQ shape where I have a low shelf dialed in at quite a high frequency and then some kind of notch to tame a big resonance that kind of is revealed by the process of pushing all of that up. And that's the kind of classic Pultec thing of where you boost and cut at the same frequency and you get a boost, but then with either a lump or a bump higher up the frequency range to kind of compensate for it. And so I'm emulating what that EQ did, but with far more precision, because I can choose exactly where that notch or that boost is, rather than being stuck with those fixed frequency ranges and all the rest of it. So does that help?
Yeah, massively. Yeah, I completely agree. I'm really skeptical about them. I just, yeah.
I mean, I think they're fun and they're interesting. That's one of the things I said about the Abbey Road thing, is that I really, you know, I'm a huge Beatles fan, and I'm a huge fan of Abbey Road in particular, the album, which is the first one where they used the TG. That's the first one where they used the TG desk. I don't know whether they used it.
I'm about 100 meters away from Penny Lane, by the way.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Yeah. That's cool. And are you a fan as well, or are you like?
Oh, massively. That's why I moved.
Oh, really? Okay. Oh, cold coffee. Okay. So, and I think I say this in the Waves video. I have no idea whether the sound that I get really has any relation to an actual TG mastering chain set of processing. And I don't even know whether they used the TG in mastering on Abbey Road. And I certainly don't know whether it contributed anything to the tom sound at the beginning of Come Together. But I love the idea that it might. And I feel like, you know, there's a kind of that big sort of soft sound to those, you know, the doo-doo-doo thing. And I feel like using that plugin on the song that I used for the example gave me a little bit of that quality, which I really liked for it. It's not something I would do without a client's permission or without consulting them, or at least explaining what I was doing. But in particular, if somebody kind of asked for something, then that's another situation where you might bring something out of the toolbox. Is like if somebody specifically requests some kind of effect or some kind of character or quality that wouldn't normally be there in the normal tools that you use. So yeah, it's really fun to have that. And I think I would definitely play around with, use those things all the time in mixing. I mean, just another. On the whole, I'm not a huge fan of Waves plugins, but the Abbey Road stuff I think is really good. And the emulation of the ADT automated double tracking thing, that's brilliant. I mastered or mixed an album for a friend of mine a couple of years back, and he recorded the whole thing in the attic of his house, complete with the sound of the central heating pipes going, which had to be denoised. But anyway, and he recorded all kinds of things in mono that I wanted to be in stereo. Like there was he used a sample of a Fender Rhodes that was in mono, and I wanted to be in stereo, and a few other things. And I just like most of the mixes, 4 or 5 different things were going through this Waves ADT process. Again, I have no idea whether it actually sounds like their original processing or not. It just worked in the context of that mix. And and I really liked the effect that it had. So I think that's the way that I kind of use those things. So maybe that's another slightly different answer to the question I haven't given before. I don't use them because I think, oh, I want a Fairchild sound on this, or I want whatever. It's if I've tested a plugin and it does something that I like, I kind of file it away, and then I might bring that out for some particular situation or kind of moment where it seems appropriate. For what it's worth. So I'm not saying that they have no value or they have no use, but it's and I certainly think that whether or not they actually sound really like the original thing is pretty much of a red herring. It's at the end of the day, it's, well, do they do something useful? Do they do something nice? All that stuff. Okay, we have a reply from James. I found a 0 milliseconds look ahead sounds a touch more aggressive, a bit like clipping, and the longer look aheads have a smoother response to transients with more high end. Definitely subtle, but hey, I should experiment with it. We're talking about this back to the Pro L now and the whole look ahead thing. And yes, it's entirely possible that there's an element of clipping in the sound if you don't have. I mean, the end of the sound, the end of the day, with a limiter, if you have a signal that goes whack above 0 and there's no look ahead in the limiter, what's it going to do with it? If the goal is to restrict it to 0, it has to have a super fast attack time to get control of that signal. And if it's that fast, it's basically indistinguishable to clipping. But it's then really a case of what happens immediately after that. I think, actual clipping will just square the waveform off, but whereas some kind of processor that's doing this job can choose to do something different that hopefully will sound better. And I do use soft clipping reasonably often. Again, not every master, but maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 5 perhaps. So that's definitely part of the sound that I go for. And given that that's the case, if there's a little bit of that kind of flavor in the limiter that I'm using, it's probably not going to upset me. I mean, this is the other thing, I guess, something I haven't said yet, is that when it's this really fast stuff, it's really hard to hear. I mean, I'm not a fan of hard digital clipping at all. But if it happens just very briefly on something really spiky and fast, you're probably not going to be able to hear it. So it's, on the one hand, I don't allow it to happen. I only clip things by choice, and I use soft clipping to get the result that I want. But that doesn't. It is a valid technique to use sometimes. So yeah, it's not kind of completely the spawn of the devil. 0 milliseconds definitely sounds like there's a tiny bit of distortion on Punchy. Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. I think that's probably, but again, it depends how hard you use it and what you use it on. And hopefully the strategies that I'm using when I'm mastering are restricting it to the kind of the really transient stuff, which is not such a big problem. Tim says, authorize my Facebook access. I need to catch up on that. If you signed up in the last week or so, I may not have done it yet. I will look at that. And James says, I'm a sucker for the UAD Fairchild with no compression setting in almost any processing chain. So UAD is another thing I haven't played with. They offered me a box in return for doing some testing and doing a couple of blog posts for them, which I was interested in. I just haven't had the time. And I mean, a Fairchild is I don't know, it's got 16 valves or something in it. It's going to, and valves can sound lovely on some material. So it's going to do something. And yeah, if you like it, then great. But it's definitely a flavor that I bring out. I think if I felt like I was using something with that kind of flavor on every master that I did, like I know some mastering engineers who put everything through a mastering chain that always has some valves in it. That to me doesn't feel right. because I mean, you know, in particular these days, if there's any kind of a particular objection I have to stuff that's coming in to the client work that I'm being asked to work on, it's that people are just overcooking things with the overall level, but also with all the saturation involved. You know, so when I started working in digital, you know, this is back in the days of ADATs, and you know, the SPX 90 was still a box that you could buy and have in a rack. There was none of this kind of saturation. It was all about avoiding clipping and saturation and getting away from all that tape distortion and all of those things that annoyed all of the engineers in the 80s so much. You know, there's interviews with Trevor Horn where he's talking about how much he hated the fact that every time you played a piece of analog tape, you came back with less top on it. Whereas now people are loving the emulations of all that kind of stuff. So those things weren't an option back then. I've forgotten what I was saying. Oh yeah, but nowadays I think they're 10 to a dozen. You know, everybody, there's like 100 different saturation plugins you could choose, and 100 different tape emulations and console emulations and all the rest of it. And I just think people overdo those things, and in particular they overdo them often because they run them too hot. People are not. And one of the main things that I do in the video on the Waves Abbey Road thing is talk about gain structure and the fact that you can't run the input, particularly because the compression section doesn't have a threshold. So the way that I work, push the fader up, get more compression. That's the only way to work with the TG mastering chain. So therefore it's crucial to get the input gain right, to get the amount of dynamics processing that you want, to get the sound that you're looking for. That applies to most things that emulate analog hardware. And people are looking at peak levels maybe and maximizing them and then pushing them into the hardware. And if that means that the loudness is going in at -14 or -12 VU, RMS, LUFS, whatever you want to call it, that's probably 4 to 6 dBs louder than the piece of gear that's being emulated was intended to get. Now that's not to say that that's not a valid artistic choice. You know, the Beatles were one of the first bands to deliberately overload the input on the desk for the guitar sound on Revolution. And some people say they invented heavy metal along the way, which probably isn't true. But they did that by choice. The risk with plugins like this is that if you don't understand about gain structure and you're automatically running everything through too hot, you're just doing that to everything by mistake. And if it sounds fantastic and you love it and all the rest of it, well, then it all ends up okay. But maybe you know, if the goal of emulating a piece of analog hardware is to get some of the magic, some of the mojo, I think you should start off using it as it was intended to be used and then learn how to abuse it, not abuse it by mistake. Anyway, we're kind of way off topic at this point. But hopefully there's something useful in there for you guys. So anyway, thank you very much to everybody for showing up. Thanks for all the questions. Great questions make for a great Q&A. As I say, if I get enough in the next few weeks, then I will run another session later on in the course. And if not, then I'll certainly happy to reply to kind of the odd question here and there by email. I hope you're enjoying the course, and thanks for listening.